The morning fog clings to Fifth Avenue like a funeral shroud, November 1927. At the corner of 57th Street, a demolition crew gathers, their tools glinting dully in the gray light. Before them rises a monument to an impossible dream, a French Renaissance palace that occupies an entire Manhattan city block. 130 rooms, limestone carved into flowering vines and cherubs, windows that once blazed with gaslight and crystal chandeliers. This is the Vanderbilt Mansion, the largest private residence ever constructed in New York City, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore who had bent America's railroads to his will and died the richest man in the nation. The workers lift their sledgehammers. The first blow sends limestone chips scattering across the sidewalk. The sound echoes down the avenue like a death knell. For 45 years, this palace had been a cathedral to wealth. Its facade gleamed white as bone. Inside, gold leaf caught the light on every ceiling. Marble from Italian quarries lined the halls. Woods harvested from distant forests formed intricate patterns underfoot. Every surface whispered the same message. Here lives wealth beyond measure, beyond imagination, beyond the reach of ordinary humanity. But now the sledgehammers fall. The palace is coming down, not because of fire, not because of earthquake or structural failure. It's being erased because in this new America, nobody wants it anymore. The annual property tax bill, $30,000, has become an impossible burden. The army of servants required to maintain it can no longer be found. The world that built such monuments has vanished as completely as morning mist. The Gilded Age began in the 1870s, in the smoking ruins of a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. Industrial capitalism created a new American royalty almost overnight. Men who controlled the railroads, who dominated steel production, who monopolized oil distribution, built urban palaces to rival Versailles. They threw parties that cost more than working families would earn in 3 lifetimes. They purchased the masterworks of European civilization, married their daughters to impoverished nobles with ancient titles, and lived with a level of extravagance that seemed almost biblical in its excess. By the late 1920s, that world lay in ruins. The palaces were falling beneath wrecking balls, replaced by department stores where anyone with money could shop. The great fortunes faced taxation that would have been unthinkable 50 years earlier. The entire social architecture that had supported this way of life had collapsed, crushed beneath the weight of World War, progressive reform, and a fundamental transformation in American values. This is the story of how the Gilded Age died, not in a single catastrophic moment, but across decades of mounting pressure. Labor movements that refused to be broken, journalists who exposed the machinery of exploitation, politicians who harnessed popular rage into reform, and the cold mathematics of economic reality that made palaces unsustainable. A society built on staggering inequality couldn't endure once those at the bottom decided they would no longer accept their place. When the Vanderbilt mansion fell, it marked more than the destruction of a building. It marked the death of an entire American dream. The Vanderbilt mansion wasn't just large, it was incomprehensible. From Fifth Avenue to Madison Avenue, from 57th Street to 58th, an entire city block transformed into one family's private domain. 130 rooms sprawled across multiple floors like a city within the city. Ballrooms capable of swallowing 300 guests in their glittering embrace. A library that climbed 2 full stories, its shelves groaning with rare volumes bound in leather, their gilt spines catching the light. Dining rooms where dozens could feast beneath ceilings that dripped with gold leaf like frozen honey. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had commissioned this monument in 1882, not because he needed this much space. A man needs shelter, perhaps a few rooms for comfort. No, he built it because he could. Because by the time Cornelius reached maturity, the Vanderbilt name meant railroads. And railroads meant wealth that most Americans couldn't begin to comprehend. wealth that demanded expression in limestone and marble and gold. The architect George Brown Post poured his genius into every detail. The construction devoured $3 million, the equivalent of 90 million in modern currency, for a single house, for one family's statement to the world. The exterior spoke in the language of French chateaux, steep roof lines cutting sharp angles against the sky, stone carving that covered every visible surface, limestone transformed by master craftsmen into forests of decorative detail. In afternoon light, the walls glowed golden, as if the building itself were minted from precious metal. But the interior exceeded even these extravagant promises. The entrance hall soared 3 stories overhead, its walls sheathed in carved oak, its windows filled with stained glass that painted the marble floors in shifting colors. Light itself became a luxury. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers, each one holding 100 candles. The dining room could have served as a cathedral, its scale designed to humble anyone who entered. When Cornelius II died in 1899 at just 55, his heart worn out from the endless work of managing the family's railroad empire, his widow Alice inherited this impossible burden. She continued living in the enormous house, a solitary figure moving through its vast spaces. She maintained the staff, upheld the social obligations, played her part in the endless theater that was Gilded Age society. The parties continued, the balls, the formal dinners where New York's elite gathered to reinforce their position at the summit of American life. But even before the Great War, the ground was shifting beneath these palaces. Property taxes climbed steadily as the city assessed these estates at their true, staggering value. Labor costs increased as servants began to understand their own power, began to demand better wages. Heating 130 rooms through a New York winter meant burning coal by the literal ton. Repairs never ended. Paint faded, roofs leaked, masonry cracked. Everything demanded constant, massive expenditure. The war accelerated every challenge. Finding servants became nearly impossible. Young men who might have worked as footmen and butlers were instead dying in French mud. Young women who would have been maids discovered that factories offered better pay and something more valuable: freedom. The social world that revolved around elaborate entertaining began to seem antiquated. Worse than antiquated, obscene. While thousands of American boys were being slaughtered in European trenches, throwing parties that cost more than those soldiers would earn in 10 lifetimes felt like a moral crime. Alice Vanderbilt remained in the mansion until 1926, an elderly woman in her 80s, rattling through 130 empty rooms. The neighborhood was transforming around her. Commercial buildings rose where neighboring mansions had stood. Fifth Avenue was becoming a canyon of business rather than an exclusive residential preserve. When Alice died, her heirs faced arithmetic as cold and merciless as a January wind. The property tax alone consumed $30,000 annually. Add heating, electricity, basic maintenance, insurance. The bare minimum carrying costs exceeded $100,000 every single year. To actually live in the house, to use it as it was designed, you needed to employ 30 to 50 servants. That meant another 100,000 or more in annual wages, plus room and board for live-in staff. The numbers were impossible to escape. Nobody in the family wanted this burden. The younger generation of Vanderbilts preferred townhouses with modern conveniences, apartments with elevators and central heating. They owned country estates for weekend retreats. They didn't need a city palace that devoured money like a dragon consuming gold. The property was listed at $7 million for land and building combined. No buyer emerged who wanted it as a residence. The location was far too valuable for that. This was prime Manhattan real estate. The building itself was worthless. Worse than worthless. It was an obstacle that needed to be removed before the land could be put to profitable use. Bergdorf Goodman, the luxury department store, made the purchase. They wanted the land. The mansion meant nothing to them. The wrecking crews arrived in 1927. They began at the top, removing slate roof tiles one by one. each tile that had been laid with such care now tossed aside like rubbish. They worked their way down methodically, floor by floor, dismantling what had taken years to build. They salvaged what they could. Carved limestone panels were carefully removed, destined for collectors who wanted fragments of lost grandeur. Marble mantels were extracted from fireplaces that had warmed countless society gatherings. Oak paneling was pulled from walls where it had witnessed 4 decades of wealth and power. Some of these fragments were sold, most became landfill. New Yorkers gathered on the sidewalks to watch. Some felt genuine grief at the loss of what was undeniably a landmark, a piece of the city's identity being erased. Others saw only progress, the city marching inevitably forward, making room for the future by demolishing the past. The mansion represented an era that felt increasingly foreign. When it was built 45 years earlier, America had no income tax, no labor regulations, no limits on how obscenely rich the wealthy could become. That world had disappeared, swept away by forces the original builders never imagined. The demolition stretched across months. Newspapers documented the slow death, printing photographs that captured each stage of destruction. The chateau facade punctured with gaping holes where windows had been. Interior rooms suddenly exposed to weather and sky. The grand staircase that had carried society women in their jewels and silk now leading nowhere, ending in empty air. And finally, just bare earth where one of America's greatest houses had stood. Bergdorf Goodman erected a sleek new store on the site. Art Deco styling, all clean lines and geometric precision. Large display windows designed to entice shoppers inside. The new building embodied completely different values: commerce over aristocracy, modern efficiency over Gilded Age extravagance, public access rather than private exclusivity. Anyone with money could walk through those doors, no calling cards required, no social credentials necessary. The Vanderbilt mansion wasn't the first Fifth Avenue palace to fall beneath the wrecking ball, but its size and symbolic importance made its destruction definitive. When the largest house built by one of America's wealthiest families couldn't survive, it confirmed what many had suspected. The Gilded Age was truly irrevocably finished. But the question demands an answer. Why? What forces destroyed a social and economic system that had seemed as permanent as the limestone facades themselves? April 1865. The Civil War ends. 600,000 men lie dead. The South is a smoking ruin. The North has won, but victory raises questions as troubling as the war itself. What kind of country will America become? The answer arrives not in political speeches or constitutional amendments, but on rails of steel. Before the war, America existed as a collection of disconnected regional economies. The Northeast manufactured goods in growing cities. The South produced cotton on plantations built on enslaved labor. The West remained largely empty, a vast frontier that existed more in imagination than reality. Moving goods between these regions was agonizingly slow and prohibitively expensive. Canals helped, but they froze solid in winter. Roads were terrible, often impassable in rain. Transportation took weeks or months. Distance was a nearly insurmountable obstacle. The war changed everything. Both sides had used trains extensively for military purposes. The North especially had demonstrated how railroads could move troops and supplies with speed that seemed almost magical. Generals who truly understood logistics won battles, and logistics meant trains. After the war, that military knowledge transformed into civilian opportunity almost overnight. If trains could move entire armies with their weapons and supplies, they could move anything: grain from distant farms, cattle from open ranges, steel from mills, coal from mines, people seeking new lives. The country just needed tracks connecting everywhere to everywhere else. The great project of the post-war era was building that network. In 1869, something extraordinary happened. Two railroad companies building from opposite directions met in Promontory, Utah. East met west. The transcontinental line was complete. You could now travel from New York to San Francisco entirely by train. What had taken 6 months by wagon, a journey filled with danger and hardship, now took 6 days in relative comfort. The impact rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water. Suddenly, the West wasn't isolated anymore. Farmers could ship wheat to eastern cities profitably. Ranchers could send cattle to Chicago stockyards for slaughter. Miners could move ore to smelters thousands of miles away. Towns sprang up along railroad lines like mushrooms after rain. Empty prairie transformed into productive farmland. The country wasn't separate regions anymore. It was one integrated national market where goods and people could flow freely. Building all those rail lines required enormous amounts of capital, far more money than any individual could provide alone. So companies sold stock and bonds to investors hungry for returns. Those investors made fortunes when the ventures succeeded, and some particularly ambitious individuals gained control of multiple railroad companies, creating networks that spanned entire states and regions, wielding power that approached that of governments. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the legendary Commodore, was the first to truly understand what railroad consolidation could mean. He'd started in steamships, making a substantial fortune moving people and goods on water. In the 1860s, he made a pivotal shift into trains, but he didn't build new lines. That was too risky, too expensive. Instead, he bought existing lines and connected them into efficient, integrated systems. By the 1870s, Vanderbilt controlled the New York Central Railroad, which connected New York City directly to Chicago, the beating heart of the Midwest. He also controlled lines to Buffalo, to Albany, to dozens of other cities. His integrated system moved freight and passengers far more efficiently than smaller competitors could hope to match. Efficiency meant massive profits, and profits made Vanderbilt one of the richest men in America. When he died in 1877, his fortune exceeded $100 million. In today's currency, that represents over $2 billion, the largest American fortune accumulated up to that point in history. He left most of it to one son, William, who proved even more skilled at multiplying wealth. But railroads were just one opportunity in this rapidly industrializing nation. The expanding rail network created voracious demand for other industries, most especially steel. Track required steel rails. Miles and miles of steel rail constantly wearing out from use, constantly needing replacement. The railroads were hungry for steel, and that hunger would make men wealthier than even the railroad barons. Andrew Carnegie saw that opportunity with remarkable clarity. A Scottish immigrant who'd started as a humble telegraph operator, earning pennies, Carnegie worked his way up through railroad management. He learned intimately how the business operated, what it needed, where the bottlenecks and inefficiencies lay. He understood that fortunes weren't made in management. They were made in providing what the managers desperately needed. In the 1870s, he made his pivot from transportation to steel production. He built massive mills around Pittsburgh, facilities that used the newest technology available, the Bessemer process. This revolutionary technique could produce steel dramatically faster and cheaper than traditional methods. Carnegie's mills ran with ruthless efficiency, producing enormous quantities at lower cost than competitors could match. But Carnegie didn't just make steel. He understood something that would define modern capitalism. He controlled every single step of the process through what became known as vertical integration. He bought iron ore mines in Minnesota, controlling his raw materials at the source. He bought coal mines in Pennsylvania to fuel his furnaces. He bought ships to transport ore across the Great Lakes. He bought rail lines to move materials to his mills. This vertical integration meant he didn't depend on anyone else for anything. Every single dollar that could potentially be extracted from the steel business stayed within Carnegie's system. By the 1880s, Carnegie Steel dominated American production completely. The company's profits were staggering, almost unbelievable. Carnegie himself was accumulating wealth that rivaled the Vanderbilt. Then there was oil, a brand new industry that had barely existed before the Civil War. In 1859, the first commercial oil well had been drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania, opening up possibilities nobody had imagined. Initially, oil meant kerosene for lamps, a replacement for expensive whale oil that was growing scarce as whale populations dwindled. That market alone was substantial and growing rapidly. John D. Rockefeller understood something crucial that others completely missed. The real money wasn't in drilling for oil. That was far too risky and unpredictable. Some wells came up dry, leaving investors with nothing. Others overproduced, flooding the market and crashing prices. It was a gambler's game. The real money, the stable money, was in refining crude oil and controlling its distribution. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. The company bought crude from drillers, refined it into kerosene and other products, and sold it to distributors nationwide. But Rockefeller's true genius was in the deals he negotiated. He secured secret agreements with railroad companies for preferential shipping rates that his competitors couldn't access. He ruthlessly undercut competitors on price until they went bankrupt or agreed to sell out to him. He systematically bought competing refineries, combining them into one massive, unstoppable operation. By 1882, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. It was a complete monopoly. Rockefeller organized his sprawling holdings as a trust, a clever legal structure that let him control dozens of companies while technically keeping them separate entities. The trust made Rockefeller the richest man in America, far richer than Vanderbilt had been, even richer than Carnegie. By some estimates, at his absolute peak, Rockefeller's wealth equaled over $400 billion in today's dollars, the richest American in history. These three men, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, along with others like them in different industries, created unprecedented concentrations of wealth in astonishingly short periods. The speed was truly remarkable. Vanderbilt built his fortune in roughly 2 decades. Carnegie did it in 1, Rockefeller even faster. They accomplished this in an environment with virtually no regulation whatsoever. No income tax existed until 1913. No antitrust laws until 1890. No labor laws protecting workers from exploitation. No requirements for workplace safety. No limits on working hours or minimum wages. Companies could do essentially whatever they wanted. Workers, meanwhile, had essentially no protections at all. If you were injured on the job, that was entirely your problem. If you were fired, you had no recourse. If your wages were cut, you either accepted it or quit, and unemployment meant potential starvation because there was no welfare system, no government assistance of any kind. You worked or you starved. Those were the only options. This combination of massive industrial growth plus zero regulation created fortunes faster than any previous era in human history. But it also created inequality on a scale America had never before witnessed. The top 1% owned more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. The wealthy lived in palaces that rivaled European royalty. The poor lived in disease-ridden tenements without plumbing or heat, entire families crammed into single rooms. The term robber baron was coined specifically to describe these industrialists. Critics argued passionately that they'd essentially stolen their fortunes through monopoly power, political corruption, and brutal exploitation of workers. Defenders called them captains of industry, arguing they'd built the infrastructure that transformed America into an economic superpower. Both descriptions held considerable truth. These men had indeed built railroad networks, steel mills, and oil refineries that fundamentally transformed the nation. American industrial output soared. Cities grew explosively. Living standards rose dramatically for many people, but the benefits distributed extremely unevenly. The men at the top accumulated wealth beyond measure. Meanwhile, workers in their factories and mines struggled desperately just to survive. And those men at the top needed somewhere to live, not just houses, palaces, monuments, structures that announced their phenomenal success to the world. They needed mansions that screamed wealth and power from every stone, Fifth Avenue in New York City became the place to build them. Money alone didn't guarantee entry into Gilded Age high society. The Vanderbilts discovered this painfully, and the lesson stung like a slap across the face. When William Henry Vanderbilt, son of the legendary Commodore, attempted entering New York's elite social circles in the 1870s, he found doors firmly closed. His family possessed $100 million. They owned vast railroad networks. They wielded enormous economic power. None of it mattered socially, not one bit. Established New York families considered the Vanderbilts nouveau riche, new money, common, vulgar. The Commodore had started as a ferryboat operator, getting his hands dirty in actual work. That association with manual labor, with trade, with commerce, never quite washed off. No amount of millions could scrub away that stain. The Vanderbilts desperately needed someone to legitimize them, someone who controlled access to the upper echelons of society with absolute authority, someone whose approval meant acceptance and whose rejection meant permanent social exile. That someone was Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor, always referred to simply as Mrs. Astor, never by her first name. To use her first name would imply a familiarity that few possessed. Caroline came from old New York wealth, the kind considered truly respectable because it had been accumulated slowly over generations. The Schermerhorns had been prosperous since colonial times. When Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, she joined another impeccably established family. The Astors had made their original fortune in fur trading and Manhattan real estate, old enough to be respectable, rich enough to be powerful. By the 1870s, Caroline decided that someone needed to impose order on New York society. Too many new millionaires were appearing almost overnight. Railroad money, oil money, steel money, all that new wealth threatened to overwhelm the old families, to dilute their exclusivity. Without strict gatekeepers, anyone with money could potentially claim social position. The very idea was intolerable. She appointed herself that gatekeeper, and she proved ruthlessly effective. Carolyn recruited help in the form of Ward McAllister, a Southerner who'd made money in California and retired to New York with social ambitions. He had refined tastes, extensive European travel experience, and the leisure to devote to planning elaborate entertainments. He became Caroline's social secretary, her advisor, her enforcer. Together, they built a system, a rigid hierarchy, an elaborate set of rules and rituals designed to separate the acceptable from the unacceptable. First came the concept of the 400. McAllister coined the term in 1888, though Caroline had operated on this principle for years. The idea was elegantly simple and brutally exclusive. New York's true inner circle consisted of exactly 400 people, no more, no less. That number supposedly reflected the capacity of Caroline's ballroom at 840 Fifth Avenue. The actual number was somewhat arbitrary. What truly mattered was the principle of fixed exclusivity. By defining membership as a specific limited number, Caroline and McAllister made inclusion extraordinarily valuable. If only 400 people counted among millions in New York, then being one of those 400 meant absolutely everything. How did one gain entry? Caroline decided, period. There was no application process, no objective criteria you could meet. She simply determined who belonged and who didn't, based on her personal judgment. Her approval granted access to everything that mattered socially. Her disapproval meant permanent exile. Old money families were automatically included: the Livingstons, the Stuyvesants, the Rhinelanders, families who'd been wealthy since before the American Revolution. That gave her a solid base of perhaps 50 to 75 families she considered unquestionably legitimate. The remaining slots went to new money families who somehow proved themselves acceptable over extended periods of time. Proving yourself meant demonstrating proper behavior consistently over years, sometimes decades, having the right connections, the right taste, the right club memberships, and most importantly, it meant Caroline personally liking you. The Vanderbilts struggled for years despite their staggering wealth. The Commodore was too rough, too openly involved in the dirty business of commerce. Caroline found him utterly vulgar. His son William was more refined, better educated, more polished, but he was still too closely associated with trade and business. That taint of commerce clung to him. Not until William's wife Alva brilliantly forced the issue did the Vanderbilts finally gain entry. In 1883, Alva threw a costume ball so elaborate, so expensive, so magnificently excessive that Caroline simply couldn't ignore it any longer. The ball consumed over $250,000, equivalent to over $6 million today. 1,200 guests attended in elaborate costumes. The entire house was decorated like a European palace. Thousands of roses filled every room. Orchestras played from multiple locations. It was an unmistakable statement. The Vanderbilts had arrived. Whether Caroline liked it or not, they were demanding recognition. Caroline attended. She had no choice. The event was too spectacular to ignore. And once she accepted the Vanderbilts, other families quickly followed. The family was finally officially legitimate. Alva had won. This entire social system required constant, exhausting maintenance. Caroline held regular receptions during the social season, which ran from November through early spring. She hosted formal dinners with precisely choreographed seating arrangements. She attended the opera in her permanent box, positioned to survey the entire house and note who attended. The season operated on strict, unbreakable schedules. Monday was opera night. Everyone who mattered attended the Metropolitan Opera, not primarily to hear the music, but to be seen. The performances were almost secondary to the social display. The boxes were carefully arranged by social status. Carolyn's box was in the prime location. Calling cards were essential to this elaborate dance. Ladies left cards when visiting. If you weren't home, you left your card in a silver tray the butler held at the door. The cards conveyed subtle messages through their positioning in folded corners. Different days were designated for receiving calls. Tuesday might be Caroline's at-home day. Calling on Tuesday meant she'd receive you graciously. Calling on Wednesday meant you'd be turned away. Young women made their formal debut during carefully orchestrated balls. These debutante presentations introduced daughters to high society, marking them as eligible for marriage to appropriate young men. The most important social events happened at Caroline's own balls. Being invited meant your family had truly arrived. Not being invited meant you simply didn't exist socially, no matter how much money you had. The whole system was specifically designed to prevent social mobility. Caroline and her inner circle desperately wanted to preserve their position at the very top by creating complex rules and arcane rituals, by making acceptance require her personal approval rather than any objective standard. She ensured that new money couldn't simply buy their way in. Money was necessary, but not sufficient. They had to be granted entry like supplicants at a royal court. But the system had a critical vulnerability. It required that new money actually care about social acceptance. It depended on wealthy industrialists wanting to join high society badly enough to submit to Caroline's rules. The first generation of robber barons often didn't care. The Commodore Vanderbilt reportedly didn't give a damn what Caroline Astor thought of him. He had money and power. That was enough. The second generation cared far more. William Vanderbilt, and especially his ambitious wife Alva, desperately wanted social acceptance. They understood that position mattered for business connections, for their children's marriage prospects, for how the entire family was perceived. The third generation cared most of all. By the 1890s and 1900s, young Vanderbilts, Astors, and other wealthy heirs grew up simply assuming they belonged at the top of society. They'd never known anything else. The social structure seemed completely natural and permanent to them. Caroline maintained her iron grip on New York society until her death in 1907. By then, she was elderly and increasingly confused, but she was still acknowledged as the ultimate arbiter of social acceptability. Her word remained law. After her death, several other women tried claiming her powerful role. None succeeded completely. The social world she dominated so absolutely began to fragment. Multiple women claimed authority over different circles. The rules gradually became less rigid. but during Caroline's peak years, roughly 1875 to 1900, she wielded power that money alone absolutely could not buy. She decided who mattered in New York society and who didn't. And the wealthy families busily building those massive mansions on Fifth Avenue all desperately sought her approval. They built their palaces partly to impress her, to prove themselves worthy. Those mansions themselves were statements, declarations of wealth and taste, elaborate attempts to prove worthiness through stone and marble and gold. Fifth Avenue became the grand stage where those declarations played out for all the world to see. In 1870, Fifth Avenue above 51st Street was mostly empty, a few modest brownstone houses scattered here and there. Vacant lots where nothing grew but weeds, trees lining quiet streets. The atmosphere was almost suburban, peaceful, ordinary. The truly fashionable residential district sat much further downtown, around Washington Square, where old families had built their homes decades earlier. 20 years later, everything had changed beyond recognition. The stretch from 55th Street climbing up to 95th had transformed into the most expensive residential real estate in all of America. Block after block of massive limestone mansions, French chateaux that looked transplanted from the Loire Valley, Italian Renaissance palaces that could have stood in Florence, Beaux-Arts extravaganzas dripping with ornament, each one seemingly larger and more elaborate than the last, as if the builders were engaged in some mad competition to outdo their neighbors. This was Vanderbilt Row, Carnegie Hill, Millionaire's Mile, the physical manifestation of Gilded Age wealth, rising with remarkable speed from empty lots to completed palaces. The transformation began with the Vanderbilts, naturally. William Henry Vanderbilt, son of the Commodore, started it in 1879 when he commissioned a massive brownstone complex at Fifth Avenue and 51st Street. But he wasn't satisfied with one house. That wouldn't make a sufficient statement. He built 3 connected residences forming a single enormous complex, one for himself and his wife, one for each of his 2 married daughters and their families. The entire complex consumed nearly $2 million. But brownstone already felt somewhat outdated, too ordinary. The really fashionable material was limestone, brilliant white, elegant, more European in appearance, and the fashionable style was French, specifically the grand chateau of the Loire Valley that housed French nobility. Never mind that French nobles had built those chateaux slowly over centuries, adding wings and towers across generations. American millionaires wanted them immediately, built in 2 years, money could buy speed. Richard Morris Hunt became the architect of choice for this new plutocracy. He'd studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the first American ever admitted to that institution. He understood French architecture intimately and authentically, not from books but from years of study in France itself. More importantly, he understood his wealthy American clients perfectly. He knew what they wanted. They wanted grandeur that announced itself from blocks away. They wanted to impress everyone who saw their homes. They wanted buildings that proclaimed wealth without subtlety or restraint. Hunt delivered exactly what they desired. In 1883, he designed a spectacular mansion for William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife Alva. The house rose on Fifth Avenue at 52nd Street, directly across from William Henry Vanderbilt's brownstone complex. A challenge, a statement. It was French Gothic in style, gray limestone that seemed to glow in certain light, steep roofs cutting dramatic angles against the sky, elaborate carved ornament covering every visible surface, each detail executed by master craftsmen. Inside were genuine medieval tapestries imported from French estates, magnificent stained glass that filled rooms with colored light, carved wood paneling salvaged from actual French chateaux and reinstalled in this American palace. The house consumed $3 million in construction. Another $2 million went to furnishing and decorating it properly, filling it with European treasures. The Vanderbilt Chateau set the pattern that others would frantically compete to match or exceed. Suddenly, every millionaire wanted a piece of European history transplanted to Fifth Avenue, a French palace, an Italian Renaissance villa, a Beaux-Arts hotel particulier, anything European, anything that suggested centuries of aristocratic breeding and refinement. Even if the fortune funding it was less than a decade old and made in steel mills or oil refineries, the architectural competition escalated with dizzying speed. If the Vanderbilts built at 52nd Street, the Astors would build something bigger at 65th. If Carnegie commissioned a house at 91st, someone else would inevitably go even further uptown with something more elaborate. Each mansion tried desperately to outdo its neighbors in size, cost, and sheer overwhelming opulence. Andrew Carnegie built his palace between the 90th and the 91st Streets in 1899. After studying the other mansions carefully, he'd walked Fifth Avenue, examining each palace, and decided they were all far too ostentatious, too obviously desperate for attention. His would be different, simpler, more elegant, more refined and understated. A palace, yes, but one that suggested confidence rather than insecurity. It still cost over $1 million and occupied an entire block front. Simple was always relative when discussing Gilded Age mansions, but Carnegie genuinely believed his was more tasteful than the others, more appropriate for a man of his cultural sophistication. Henry Clay Frick, Carnegie's business partner who would later become his bitter rival, built further downtown at 75th Street. His mansion was specifically designed from the beginning to eventually become a museum. Frick was already collecting old master paintings with serious intent and substantial funds. He wanted a house that would display them properly for future generations. Classical architecture, large galleries with perfect proportions, natural lighting carefully calculated. The house opened in 1914, just as the entire era was drawing to a close. The Astors built multiple houses up and down the avenue, marking their territory. Caroline Astor's primary residence at 840 Fifth Avenue was actually relatively modest compared to the later palaces that would rise around it. Her son built larger, her nephews built larger still. The family owned property scattered throughout the avenue like chess pieces on a board. Astor money, made originally in Manhattan real estate decades earlier, bought more Manhattan real estate, which increased in value, generating more money to buy even more property, a perpetual wealth machine that seemed unstoppable. Senator William Andrews Clark, who'd made an enormous fortune in Montana copper mining, built perhaps the single most excessive mansion of the entire era. 121 rooms sprawling across multiple floors, 4 separate art galleries for his growing collection, multiple ballrooms for entertaining on different scales. It consumed $7 million and took 7 full years to complete, finally finishing in 1911. Critics called it vulgar and tasteless, an embarrassment to the avenue. Clark didn't care even slightly. He had money and wanted everyone to know it. He wanted his wealth to be visible from blocks away. The construction boom created tremendous opportunities for architects, contractors, decorators, and skilled craftsmen from around the world. European firms exported Italian marble by the literal shipload, massive blocks quarried from the same sources that had supplied Renaissance builders. Italian artisans immigrated specifically to carve stone details on these houses, bringing old world skills to new world wealth. French decorators came to install authentic paneling and furniture in proper French style. The mansions became showcases for imported European luxury, as if the continent's finest craftsmanship could bestow legitimacy on American fortunes. Building one of these palaces wasn't remotely quick or simple. 2 to 4 years was typical for construction, sometimes longer for the most elaborate designs. During that time, neighbors had to endure constant noise from dawn to dusk and sometimes beyond, stone cutting that sent dust billowing through the air, hammering that echoed down the avenue, wagons rumbling past delivering materials all day long, their wheels grinding against cobblestones. The disruption was immense, the noise almost unbearable at times, but nobody complained too loudly. Everyone on Fifth Avenue was either currently building or actively planning to build their own mansion. Complaining about construction noise when you'd soon be creating the same disruption yourself would have been hypocritical. The houses competed in every conceivable detail: whose ballroom was largest, whose marble staircase was most impressive and expensive, whose art collection was most valuable and prestigious. The wealthy owners treated their residences like private museums, giving carefully curated tours to favored visitors, showing off recent acquisitions, impressing everyone with their refined taste and cultural knowledge. The staffing requirements were absolutely staggering, almost incomprehensible. A house with 30 to 50 rooms required at minimum 20 to 40 servants working full time. Butler, housekeeper, cook, multiple footmen, multiple maids of various ranks, kitchen staff, chauffeurs for the new automobiles that were beginning to replace carriages, grooms for the horses that were still used extensively, groundskeepers for any gardens or landscaping. The servants lived in the houses naturally. It would have been impractical for them to commute. Top floors typically held cramped staff quarters. Narrow rooms with plain furnishings and minimal decoration, totally separate from the lavish spaces below where the family lived. Servants used separate back staircases designed so they could move through the house without being seen. They weren't supposed to be visible unless they were actively serving the family. The goal was to create the illusion that the house ran itself, that meals appeared magically, that rooms cleaned themselves. The costs extended far beyond initial construction and staffing salaries. Property taxes climbed steadily and steeply as the city assessed these estates at their true staggering market value. Insurance was expensive for buildings filled with priceless art and furnishings. Heating costs in winter were enormous, almost astronomical. These houses had dozens of fireplaces that burned constantly, plus early central heating systems that consumed coal literally by the ton. Maintenance was constant and expensive. Paint faded, roofs leaked, masonry cracked and needed repair. Interior decoration required updating every few years to stay fashionable and current. But for roughly 2 decades, from about 1885 to 1905, the building continued relentlessly, almost frantically. More mansions, larger mansions, ever more elaborate mansions. Fifth Avenue became a canyon of concentrated wealth, each building trying to outshine its neighbors. Walking up the avenue meant passing palace after palace, each one loudly announcing its owner's fortune to anyone who looked. The concentration of wealth in such a small geographic area was completely unprecedented in American history. Within just 20 blocks lived families collectively worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They attended the same parties and balls. Their children married each other in strategic dynastic alliances. They sat on the same corporate boards, shaping business decisions. They dominated the same clubs. They shaped American business and finance from their Fifth Avenue drawing rooms, deciding the fate of industries and sometimes entire regions of the country. The street became a genuine tourist attraction, a spectacle. People would walk or take trolleys up Fifth Avenue just to gawk at the mansions they could never hope to afford. On Sunday afternoons, when working people had leisure time, the sidewalks filled with middle-class families staring in wonder and sometimes resentment at houses that represented more wealth than they'd see in 100 lifetimes. Parents pointed out the different architectural styles to their children. The French chateau, the Italian palace. The children pressed their faces against iron fences, trying to glimpse the gardens beyond. The wealthy residents largely ignored the gawkers or quietly resented the intrusion, but they couldn't actually stop it. These were private homes, yes, but they sat on public streets. Anyone could walk past, anyone could look, and in a sense, the whole spectacular display depended on public visibility. The point was to be seen, to have your wealth acknowledged and recognized. But the wealthy wanted to control who saw them and when. They wanted to be admired from a distance, not examined up close by ordinary people. The entire system seemed rock solid and permanent, as if these palaces would stand forever. The wealthy would stay wealthy indefinitely, their fortunes secured by investments and inherited wealth. Their children would inherit and maintain these houses for generations, just as European noble families had maintained their estates for centuries. The mansions would stand as monuments to American success, proving that the United States could rival and perhaps surpass the old aristocracies of Europe. Nobody building these magnificent houses in the 1890s could imagine that within just 30 years, most would be demolished. Nobody seriously thought the system could collapse so completely and so quickly. The foundations seemed too solid, the fortunes too vast, the social structures too well established. But forces were already building that would eventually destroy everything they'd created. Those forces were gathering strength in places the Fifth Avenue residents rarely saw and certainly never visited. In factories where workers labored 16 hours a day, in disease-ridden tenements where families lived in single rooms, in newspaper offices where journalists were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions, in political movements that were organizing opposition to unchecked wealth. The backlash against Gilded Age excess was coming like a gathering storm on the horizon. The wealthy just couldn't see it yet. They were too high up in their palaces, too insulated by their servants and their social circles, too convinced of their own permanence. But the storm was coming, and it would sweep away everything they'd built. The invitation arrives 3 weeks before the event. Heavy cream-colored cardstock, engraved lettering in elegant script, your name written by a professional calligrapher, each letter perfectly formed, the date, the time, the address, and beneath it all, implicit in every line, woven into every word, the unmistakable expectation of attendance. Declining a major ball invitation without excellent cause, without a reason that would satisfy scrutiny, was social suicide. You might as well pack your bags and leave the city. These events weren't merely parties in any ordinary sense. They were arenas where reputations rose or fell based on a word, a gesture, a slight, where families arranged strategic marriages that would merge fortunes and consolidate power, where business alliances took shape over champagne and whispered conversations, where the entire social hierarchy was put on display like a museum exhibition, reinforcing who belonged at the top and who remained forever below. Preparation consumed days. For women particularly, every detail carried immense weight. The gown had to be new, or at least unworn at any recent gathering where these same people had been present. It had to be fashionable without being too daring, expensive without appearing vulgar. Threading that needle required expertise. The dress alone might cost several $1,000s, equal to what a factory worker would earn in an entire year of backbreaking labor. Then came the jewels. Diamonds were absolutely non-negotiable. You couldn't attend a major ball without diamonds. Emeralds, rubies, sapphires in abundance. The wealthiest women wore literal fortunes around their necks and wrists, tiaras that could have fed a tenement building for a year, elaborate necklaces with stones the size of robin's eggs, bracelets heavy enough to weigh down your wrists, multiple rings on every finger. The jewelry served dual purposes, displaying wealth, obviously, making your status visible from across a crowded room, but also functioning as portable assets, condensed wealth you could carry with you. If financial disaster somehow struck, jewels could be quickly sold. Many families had survived temporary financial setbacks by quietly liquidating gems. The jewelry was insurance as much as ornament. Hair demanded hours of painstaking work. Ladies' maids labored with curling irons heated over gas flames, creating elaborate styles that defied gravity, pinning in jeweled combs, adding hair pieces when necessary to achieve the desired volume. The goal was height and dramatic presence. Hair piled impossibly high created the illusion of greater stature, more commanding presence. You wanted to be seen from across the room. Men had considerably simpler requirements. Evening dress was completely standardized. Black tailcoat, white waistcoat, white bow tie, white gloves that must remain spotless throughout the evening, patent leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. The uniformity was entirely intentional. Men weren't expected to compete through clothing. Their wealth showed through their wives' and daughters' appearance. Their job was to fade into elegant uniformity while the women sparkled and competed. Carriages began arriving around 9 or 10 in the evening. The timing mattered enormously. Arriving earlier risked seeming desperate, too eager, revealing that you had nothing better to do. Arriving later risked missing crucial moments in conversations, appearing disinterested or careless. The timing required careful social calculation, understanding precisely when to arrive to make the right impression. Approaching a major mansion on ball night was genuinely spectacular, a sight you could never forget. Awnings stretched from curb all the way to the entrance, protecting guests from weather. Red carpet covered the sidewalk, giving you the sense of walking into a theater. Footmen in elaborate livery stood at rigid attention, footmen specifically chosen for their height and good looks, their uniforms worth more than most people's weekly wages. Police officers kept back the curious crowds who gathered to watch the wealthy arrive in their finery, ordinary New Yorkers pressing against barriers for a glimpse of this other world. Inside, the transformation was complete and overwhelming. Servants had worked for days preparing every detail. Every room on the ground floor opened for the event, walls pushed back where possible to create flowing space. Furniture disappeared entirely or was pushed to walls and covered with fabric. Thousands of fresh flowers filled every available space. Roses, orchids, lilies, palms in enormous decorative urns. The flowers alone might cost $10,000 for this single evening, and they'd be wilted and discarded by morning. But tonight, they created an atmosphere of overwhelming luxury. Lighting was absolutely crucial to the effect. Gas lights or early electric lights blazed throughout, banishing every shadow. Candles in elaborate candelabras added warmth and flickering movement. The goal was brilliant illumination that approached daylight. These events happened at night, but should feel bright as noon, bright enough to see everyone clearly, to judge their clothes and jewels and bearing, bright enough that diamonds sparkled and threw off light, bright enough that no shadows offered any escape from constant scrutiny. You were always visible, always being watched and evaluated. The host and hostess received guests in the main hall or drawing room, standing for hours as hundreds passed through. Everyone filed through a formal receiving line like subjects approaching royalty. Brief handshakes, polite greetings exchanged, names announced loudly by the butler so everyone could hear who had arrived. This crucial moment established who was invited, who actually attended, who truly belonged to this exclusive world. Music played from the moment the first guests arrived. A full orchestra, 20 or 30 musicians, typically positioned in a gallery or on a landing where they could be heard throughout the house but not actually seen. The musicians were there to serve, not to be noticed. Waltzes, mazurkas, polkas. Later in the evening, as the atmosphere loosened, the new daring dances arriving from Europe. The turkey trot, the bunny hug, the tango. Older guests disapproved strongly, calling them vulgar and inappropriate, but younger people insisted on dancing them anyway, pushing against the old conventions. Dancing began with strict formality that everyone understood and followed. Older married couples first, establishing the proper tone, showing how it should be done. Then younger married people, already established in society. Finally, unmarried young women with carefully appropriate partners who'd been vetted by their mothers. The order mattered enormously. Dancing out of sequence suggested disrespect for social convention, marked you as someone who didn't understand the rules. Young women attended these balls specifically to be seen and evaluated by potential husbands and their families. Their mothers watched with eagle eyes from the sidelines, carefully noting which men asked their daughters to dance, how long they danced, what they talked about. Too many dances with one particular man suggested improper attachment, hinted at an understanding that hadn't been properly arranged. Too few dances total suggested unpopularity or some fatal social flaw that would make the girl unmarriageable. Men used balls to systematically evaluate marriage prospects with calculating precision. Dancing provided valuable opportunity for extended conversation, a chance to move beyond formal parlor visits. You could assess intelligence, personality, genuine interests beyond the surface. You could judge how a woman carried herself, how she interacted with others, her poise and confidence. And of course, you could evaluate her family's wealth and social connections, which mattered every bit as much as personal qualities, sometimes more. Between dances, guests circulated through the flowing spaces, moving like water through channels. They visited different rooms, admired the art and furnishings with knowing comments, gossiped relentlessly about everyone who wasn't present to defend themselves, made pointed observations about everyone who was. Every conversation was calculated. Whom you spoke with mattered as much as what you said. Being seen in earnest discussion with important people suggested you were important too, that you had valuable information or connections worth their time. Around midnight, when energy was flagging, supper was served. Not a formal seated dinner with assigned places. That would have been too rigid. Instead, an elaborate buffet in the dining room and adjacent spaces, rooms transformed into temples of abundance, tables laden with food in staggering variety and quantity, hot dishes kept warm in chafing dishes, cold dishes displayed on ice sculptures, elaborate arrangements specifically designed to impress, to overwhelm, whole roasted pheasants with their tail feathers reattached, salmon displayed as if still swimming, lobster, oysters on mountains of ice, caviar in crystal bowls, champagne flowing constantly from fountains, an endless supply. The food alone for one night might cost $20,000, enough to support several working families for a year. Guests ate standing or seated in small informal groups that formed and dissolved like dance patterns. The deliberate informality was strategic, carefully planned. It encouraged mixing and mingling. People could move easily between groups, start new conversations, make valuable connections without the constraints of assigned seating. This was when serious business was actually discussed quietly in corners, when parents arranged introductions between their eligible children, when business alliances formed that would last decades and shape entire industries. Supper lasted an hour or more, stretching as people lingered over champagne and conversation. Then dancing resumed with noticeably increased pace and energy. Rules relaxed slightly as the night wore on. As champagne took its inevitable effect, loosening tongues and inhibitions, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Not scandalously, never scandalously, that would have ended careers and ruined reputations, but enough that laughter came easier, flowed more freely. Conversation became faster, more animated. The rigid formality of the early evening gave way to something approaching genuine enjoyment. The ball didn't end at any specific predetermined time. No announcement was made. Guests departed when they felt ready, when they'd accomplished what they came for. The host and hostess remained at their posts until the very last guests left, which might be 3 or 4 in the morning, their feet aching, their faces frozen in welcoming smiles. Servants stayed even later still, working through the night, cleaning, clearing endless dishes, removing thousands of wilted flowers, resetting furniture to its normal positions. They might work straight through until dawn broke over the city, exhausted but expected to be ready for their regular duties just hours later. The next day, newspapers covered major balls extensively in their society pages. Reporters who'd been granted access filed detailed accounts. They listed attendees, their presence or absence noted and interpreted. They described the most impressive gowns in loving detail, down to the fabric and trim. They noted carefully who danced with whom, how long, how often. These accounts were read eagerly by everyone, from society matrons to shopgirls who could never hope to attend such events, but devoured every detail. Being mentioned meant you mattered socially, that you were someone worth noting. Being ignored meant you didn't exist, regardless of how much money you had. The costs of throwing such an event were truly staggering, almost incomprehensible. A major ball easily cost $50,000 to $100,000 for a single evening. Flowers that would wilt by morning, food that would be eaten in hours, servants who'd be paid and forgotten, musicians who'd play and depart, decorations that would be dismantled the next day. That's equivalent to 2 to 4 million in today's currency. for one night of entertainment that would be completely forgotten within a week as the next ball approached. But these elaborate events weren't really about entertainment at all. That was never the point. They were displays of raw power, demonstrations of wealth so excessive it bordered on violence, opportunities to reinforce the rigid social hierarchy, to make visible who belonged at the top and who would forever remain below. Every element, from the engraved invitations that arrived weeks early to the imported flowers, to the full orchestra, to the rivers of champagne, served primarily to show that the host could easily afford it all without strain, and that the guests absolutely deserved to be there, were worthy of such extravagance. And the frequency was remarkable, almost exhausting. During the height of the social season, a major ball happened nearly every single week. Multiple smaller events happened constantly, filling every night: dinners, receptions, theater parties where entire boxes were reserved, opera nights where the performance was secondary to the social display. The wealthy class spent months every year doing essentially nothing except entertaining each other in increasingly elaborate ways, as if the entire point of their wealth was this endless round of parties. This lifestyle required enormous resources beyond just money, time, energy, staff to coordinate everything, mental bandwidth to track the complex social obligations and hierarchies, and it required that you never seriously questioned whether any of it was worthwhile, whether these parties served any purpose beyond self-reinforcement. The system worked smoothly as long as everyone agreed it mattered, as long as everyone played their assigned roles. But once people started questioning whether elaborate balls served any real purpose beyond displaying wealth, the whole elaborate structure became suddenly vulnerable, like a house of cards waiting for a strong wind. By the early 1900s, some critical voices were already questioning loudly and publicly. Progressive reformers pointed out the stark disparity with sharp words that stung. One ball cost more than a factory worker would earn in an entire lifetime of labor. The same families throwing $100,000 parties routinely employed workers at poverty wages, paid them barely enough to survive while living in unimaginable luxury. The criticism stung precisely because it was accurate, undeniable. Some hosts became defensive, wrote letters to newspapers justifying their expenditures. Others became more discreet, toned down the most obvious excess, stopped inviting newspaper reporters. A few even began questioning their own lifestyle choices privately, though they'd never admit it publicly. But mostly the balls continued because stopping meant implicitly admitting the critics were right. And the Gilded Age elite weren't ready for that admission, not yet. That would come, but not for a few more years. For now, the champagne still flowed, the orchestras still played, the jewels still sparkled, the palaces still stood, for now. A Gilded Age mansion didn't operate itself through some kind of magic, though the wealthy families who lived in them sometimes seemed to forget that. Behind every elegant ball, every formal dinner served on time and at the perfect temperature, every perfectly maintained residence that always looked spotless, stood an invisible army laboring constantly, exhausting themselves in service. The numbers were genuinely staggering when you stopped to count. A typical Fifth Avenue palace required 30 to 50 full-time staff members working every single day. Larger establishments, the truly massive ones, employed 70 or more. The Vanderbilt Cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, a summer house used only a few months each year, kept a permanent crew of 40 people year-round just to maintain it. And that didn't count temporary additional hires for special events like balls or large dinner parties, when staff numbers might double. The hierarchy below stairs was every bit as rigid and complex as the social one above. At the very top sat the butler, a position of genuine authority and respect. He supervised all male employees with absolute power. He managed the wine cellar with its thousands of bottles, knowing which vintages to serve with which courses. He oversaw formal service at every meal, orchestrating the footmen like a conductor leading an orchestra. He acted as the master's personal attendant for important occasions, A truly good butler could earn $1,200 to $2,000 annually, substantial pay for the era, reflecting the position's critical importance to the household's functioning. The housekeeper ranked equally high but supervised all female staff instead. She managed household linens, every sheet and pillowcase and tablecloth. She oversaw all cleaning operations, inspecting rooms daily. She handled household accounts and budgets, tracking every expense. She ensured absolutely everything ran smoothly, that the family never saw any of the machinery that made their comfort possible. Her salary matched the butler's, and together they formed the essential management layer that kept the entire household operating like a well-oiled machine. Below them came increasingly specialized positions, each with clearly defined duties. The cook ran the kitchen like a military operation, often with 2 or 3 assistants plus scullery maids for the dirtiest work. In the wealthiest households, the cook was frequently French, hired specifically because French cuisine carried social prestige. These culinary professionals commanded high salaries and well-deserved reputations for temperamental behavior. They threw tantrums. They quit in fury over perceived insults, but they created meals that were works of art. Ladies' maids served the mistress and adult daughters exclusively, a position of intimacy and trust. They dressed hair every morning and evening, creating elaborate styles. They maintained wardrobes meticulously, knowing every dress and its proper occasion. They packed carefully for travel, anticipating every need. They provided personal service of the most intimate kind. This was highly skilled work requiring genuine training and talent. A lady's maid needed deep knowledge of current fashions, understanding of different fabrics and their care, to style hair in elaborate ways that defied gravity, and absolute discretion about family matters and secrets she couldn't help but learn. Valets performed similar duties for the master and adult sons. They maintained wardrobes with precision. They laid out clothes for every occasion. They drew baths at the perfect temperature. They shaved their employers if required, holding sharp razors steady. The position required extensive knowledge of men's fashion and complete, unquestionable reliability. A valet who gossiped would be dismissed instantly. Footmen were young men in elaborate livery who served at table, answered doors, provided general assistance. They were chosen partly for appearance, and everyone knew it. Height mattered considerably. 6 feet tall was preferred. Good looks helped significantly. They wore fancy uniforms that cost more than most people earned in months. Uniforms specifically designed to impress visitors and reinforce the household's status. Their work was highly visible, making them part of the display, part of the show the wealthy put on. Maids divided into strict categories with clear hierarchy. Parlor maids cleaned public rooms, maintaining the showpiece spaces that guests would see. Bedroom maids handled private family chambers with different standards. Kitchen maids worked under the cook's often tyrannical direction. Laundry maids, often multiple women, tackled mountains of washing in basement laundries that were always hot and damp. Each category had its own specific duties and relative status in the servants' hierarchy. Below everyone, at the very bottom of this pyramid, came the scullery workers. They scrubbed pots until their hands bled. They cleaned floors on hands and knees. They performed the dirtiest tasks nobody else would touch. Usually young girls, often recent immigrants who spoke little English, they earned perhaps $3 weekly. They slept in tiny attic rooms that were freezing in winter and sweltering in summer. They worked brutal 16-hour days. They dreamed desperately of advancing to better positions, of escaping the scullery, though few ever did. The labor was genuinely relentless, crushing. A housemaid's day began around 6 in the morning, sometimes earlier. Light fires in fireplaces throughout the house, dozens of them in winter. Empty chamber pots, a task everyone found degrading. Bring hot water for washing to each bedroom. Prepare breakfast in the kitchen. Serve breakfast formally in the dining room. Clear breakfast and wash every dish. Clean public rooms thoroughly before the family woke and wandered downstairs, erasing every trace of your presence, all while remaining completely invisible, moving like a ghost through the house. Servants were specifically trained to fade into the background like furniture. If family members actually encountered you directly, if they had to acknowledge your presence, you'd failed at your most basic duty. The goal was to serve without being seen, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to make the house run as if by magic. After morning duties came lunch preparation and service, a smaller meal, but still requiring attention. Then afternoon tasks that varied by position. Then the elaborate process of preparing dinner, the main event of every day. Formal dinners required extraordinarily elaborate service. Multiple courses, each one perfectly timed. Proper coordination of serving so all guests received each course simultaneously. The butler orchestrated everything like a conductor leading a complex symphony. One mistake, one spilled drop, one moment of visible clumsiness could result in immediate dismissal without references, making it almost impossible to find another position. After dinner came cleaning that stretched for hours, washing mountains of dishes entirely by hand and water so hot it burned, scrubbing pots until they gleamed, putting away silver, polishing each piece, cleaning the dining room thoroughly, preparing everything for the next day so the cycle could begin again. Kitchen staff might labor until 11 at night or even later, then wake again at 6 the next morning, getting perhaps 6 hours of sleep. One day off monthly was considered standard and even generous by most employers. Some allowed even less, one day every 6 weeks or 2 months. That single day off usually meant Sunday afternoon and evening, not nearly enough time to go anywhere distant or do much of anything meaningful. Just enough to attend church services, write letters home to family, rest briefly before returning to duty. Some servants went months or even years without seeing their families, sending money home but unable to visit. Living conditions varied wildly, depending entirely on the employer. The best families provided decent rooms, adequate food, and treated their people with basic respect and human dignity. Others crammed servants into unheated attics, where ice formed on the inside of windows in winter, fed them scraps and leftovers not fit for the family table, and worked them absolutely mercilessly from dawn until late at night. Employees had essentially no recourse for mistreatment. Employment was completely at will. You could be fired instantly without any explanation or references. No job meant no income. No income meant potential homelessness and starvation on the streets. The power imbalance was total and terrifying. Servants lived in constant fear of dismissal, knowing it could come at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. The work was also genuinely dangerous in ways people today barely consider or understand. Kitchens were intensely hot, fires burning constantly for cooking and heating water. Heavy iron pots caused severe burns when mishandled. Sharp knives cut fingers and hands. Laundries used harsh caustic chemicals that damaged skin and lungs. Falls from ladders while cleaning upper windows or changing curtains killed or permanently injured people with grim regularity. No workers' compensation existed. If you got hurt badly enough that you couldn't work, you were simply dismissed and replaced with someone healthy. Your injury was your problem. The wages seemed utterly pitiful by modern standards, almost incomprehensible, but they made some sense in their specific historical context. Board and room were included as part of compensation. Servants didn't pay rent, didn't buy food, didn't purchase work clothes. Their actual wages represented money that could potentially be saved or sent to family members who needed it desperately. Many immigrant workers supported entire families back in Europe on their meager American earnings, sending most of their wages home every month. A maid earning $300 annually might send $250 of it to her parents in Ireland or Italy or Poland, keeping just enough for small personal needs. Still, the inequality was brutally stark and impossible to ignore once you really looked at it. A lady's maid earning $400 annually dressed a woman who routinely spent more than that on a single ball gown worn once and never again. Footmen earning $300 yearly served dinners where the wine alone, just the wine, cost more than their entire monthly wages. The disparity was visible daily, impossible to escape or rationalize. Some employers treated their staff remarkably well by the standards of the time. They provided gifts at Christmas, real gifts, not just token acknowledgments. They gave bonuses for long, faithful service, recognizing loyalty. They provided medical care when people fell ill instead of just dismissing them. These gestures of basic humanity created genuine loyalty in return. Workers who felt appreciated and valued often stayed for decades, becoming part of the extended family in a limited way, known and trusted. Other employers were casually cruel in ways that seem almost sociopathic today. They docked wages for minor infractions, a broken dish, or a late appearance. They prohibited followers, meaning household staff couldn't have romantic relationships or receive visitors. They dismissed pregnant maids instantly without references, ensuring they'd never find positions in other respectable homes, essentially destroying their lives. The cruelty often seemed arbitrary and pointless, cruelty for its own sake. Young women in service faced particular dangers that were rarely acknowledged publicly, but were well understood privately. Unwanted advances from men of the house or their guests were disturbingly common. The master's son, a visiting business associate. Refusing such advances could mean immediate dismissal and ruin. Accepting them could mean pregnancy and, even worse, ruin, complete social death. Some employers automatically blamed the maids regardless of circumstances, maintaining that domestic servants must have been seductive, must have invited the attention. The victims had no protection, no advocates, no justice whatsoever. They were completely powerless. Labor organizing among household workers was virtually impossible. They lived isolated with their employers, separated from each other. They worked individually, not in groups that could coordinate action. They were easily replaced from the endless stream of immigrants arriving daily. Unions focused their limited resources and energy on factory workers and miners, people who labored collectively and could strike effectively. Domestic workers remained isolated, vulnerable, forgotten by the labor movement. But by the early 1900s, something was shifting. The supply of available household help was declining noticeably. Young women were discovering other options, better options. Factory work often paid less in raw dollars, but it offered something invaluable: freedom. You could leave at the end of your shift, live independently in your own room, have privacy and a personal life, control your own time outside of working hours. Even with lower wages, many women increasingly preferred factory work to domestic service. The wealthy families noticed the change immediately and found it alarming. Finding good help became progressively more difficult. The endless stream of willing workers slowed to a trickle. Training new people constantly was exhausting and frustrating. Just as you got someone trained, they'd leave for a factory job. Wages had to increase substantially just to attract any labor at all. The economics of maintaining huge staffs grew genuinely challenging for the first time. World War I accelerated all these changes dramatically and probably irrevocably. Young men went to fight overseas or took war production jobs. Young women flooded into munitions factories supporting the massive war effort, doing work previously considered impossible for women. Domestic service began to seem old-fashioned, even degrading, servile, a relic of aristocratic Europe, not democratic modern America. The war changed how Americans thought about class and service and equality. The shortage made maintaining the enormous mansions progressively harder, eventually nearly impossible. Running a 50-room palace with half the staff it actually needed was simply impossible. You couldn't maintain standards. Corners had to be cut, rooms went uncleaned, repairs were deferred, standards inevitably declined. Costs kept rising even as service quality fell, creating an impossible squeeze. This created relentless pressure on the whole system. The mansions absolutely required substantial staff to function as they'd been designed to function. Without adequate help, they became unbearable burdens rather than impressive showpieces, more trouble than they were worth. The wealthy families who'd built these palaces, blithely assuming labor would always be cheap and readily available, found themselves trapped in houses they literally couldn't properly maintain anymore. The servants were leaving, and the palaces were beginning their slow decline toward demolition. American millionaires had a fundamental problem that all their wealth couldn't solve. They were far richer than European aristocrats, their bank accounts vastly larger. Their houses were dramatically larger than most European palaces. But nobody, absolutely nobody, seriously mistook them for nobility. The distinction was obvious and painful. They were transparently new, aggressively raw, irredeemably commercial. They'd made their money in dirty steel mills that belched black smoke, in oil refineries that reeked of petroleum, in railroad offices, making deals and crushing competitors. European nobles, by contrast, inherited ancient estates and titles going back centuries, bloodlines traced to medieval times or beyond. They possessed something money couldn't buy: legitimacy, cultural authority, the automatic respect that comes from centuries of breeding and refinement. The Americans desperately wanted that legitimacy, craved it with an intensity that approached obsession. So they turned to the one thing that might bridge that unbridgeable gap: art, acquiring masterpieces, old masters specifically, Renaissance paintings by acknowledged masters, medieval tapestries woven centuries ago, ancient sculptures excavated from classical ruins, the kind of cultural artifacts that came with centuries of documented provenance, objects that connected you to history itself. If you couldn't inherit an aristocratic lineage stretching back generations, perhaps you could buy one, or at least buy the cultural trappings that suggested one, that made you seem like you belonged among the cultured elite. The timing worked perfectly, almost miraculously, for both sides of this transaction. European nobility possessed treasures accumulated over centuries, but desperately needed cash as their agricultural incomes collapsed. American millionaires had cash pouring in, but needed cultural credentials to feel legitimate. A vigorous transatlantic market developed rapidly in the 1880s and 90s, bringing together these complementary needs. British aristocrats sold first and most eagerly, driven by genuine financial desperation. The agricultural depression of the 1870s had utterly devastated their rental incomes. The estates that had comfortably supported noble families for generations suddenly couldn't cover even basic expenses. Tenants couldn't pay rent. Land values plummeted. Income disappeared. Paintings that had hung in country houses for 2 full centuries, valued family heirlooms, went to auction houses in London. American buyers, hungry for prestige, scooped them up eagerly. J.P. Morgan led the way with almost manic enthusiasm and unlimited funds. The legendary banker assembled one of history's greatest private art holdings, a collection that rivaled major museums. He bought entire estates' contents at once, not bothering with individual pieces. Dealers would approach him with thick catalogs showing everything available. Morgan would sit with a pen, circling what he wanted. Sometimes he'd circle entire pages, buying dozens of pieces at once without seeming to care about the cost. The purchases would be carefully crated and shipped immediately across the Atlantic to New York or his London residence. Morgan acquired absolutely everything he could: paintings by old masters, illuminated medieval manuscripts, rare books bound in leather, Chinese porcelain so delicate it seemed made of light, Egyptian antiquities thousands of years old, medieval reliquaries containing supposed saints' bones, Renaissance bronzes of exquisite craftsmanship. If it was genuinely old and culturally significant and expensive, Morgan wanted to own it. His holdings eventually filled multiple warehouses scattered across cities. Much of it he never even personally saw or touched. He just owned it, possessed it, controlled it. Henry Clay Frick took a more focused and discriminating approach, refusing to buy indiscriminately. He wanted old master paintings exclusively, the very best available: Rembrandt, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Velázquez, the acknowledged masters whose names every educated person knew. He built his entire Fifth Avenue mansion specifically to display them properly, with proper reverence. Large galleries with perfect proportions, natural lighting carefully calculated by architects, climate control to preserve the canvases. The house was really a private museum that Frick happened to live in, designed more for the art than for human comfort. Frick paid absolutely astonishing prices without hesitation or negotiation. In 1911, he bought a Rembrandt portrait for $500,000, equivalent to over 15 million in today's currency for a single canvas. He considered it a genuine bargain, a wise investment. Great works only increased in value over time, he reasoned, and owning a Rembrandt meant something beyond money. It announced taste, sophistication, genuine cultural authority. It said you understood beauty and quality. The Vanderbilts acquired significant pieces too, though less systematically than Morgan or Frick, more haphazardly. They bought French furniture from the 18th century, Gobelin's tapestries woven for royalty, Italian Renaissance sculptures in marble and bronze. Whatever dealers successfully convinced them, they absolutely needed to be considered truly cultured. Their mansions gradually became museums of European decorative arts, imported wholesale and installed in American houses, transforming Fifth Avenue into a kind of displaced European gallery. William Randolph Hearst took acquiring to almost comical extremes that shocked even other collectors. He didn't just buy art, he bought entire European rooms, complete architectural elements, paneling literally ripped from French chateaux, leaving empty walls behind, ceilings from Italian palazzos, shipped in pieces across the ocean. He'd have them carefully disassembled by skilled craftsmen, shipped to America in specially built crates, and reinstalled in his various properties scattered across California. If he happened to like a particular fireplace in a Spanish monastery during a visit, he'd buy the entire monastery, take what he wanted, and abandon the rest to decay. His appetite seemed unlimited. The dealers who facilitated these massive transactions became extremely wealthy themselves, building fortunes on commissions. Joseph Duveen dominated the transatlantic trade completely. A British dealer with impeccable aristocratic connections on both sides of the ocean, he understood both worlds perfectly. He knew which European families desperately needed money and were willing to sell treasures. He knew which American millionaires wanted prestige and would pay any price. He brought them together in mutually beneficial transactions, taking substantial commissions from both sides of every deal. Duveen was also a master psychological salesman, manipulating his wealthy clients with remarkable skill. He convinced American patrons that certain artists mattered far more than others, that you needed specific names in your collection to be taken seriously. He promoted Rembrandt heavily, building the Dutch master's reputation, Dutch masters generally, Italian Renaissance works. He systematically downplayed artists whose available output was harder for him to sell profitably or whose prices were too low to generate good commissions. His personal influence shaped what American private galleries looked like for decades, determining which artists became fashionable and which faded from view. The scale of the transatlantic cultural transfer was genuinely enormous, almost incomprehensible. Between 1870 and 1914, thousands of significant artworks left Europe permanently for America, never to return. The Louvre and National Gallery in London lost nothing, being protected national institutions. But countless private estates scattered across the British countryside were utterly gutted, stripped of treasures. Works that had hung in English manor houses for centuries, seen by generations of the same families, ended up decorating Fifth Avenue mansions owned by men who'd made their fortunes in steel and oil just years earlier. Europeans had deeply mixed feelings about this massive transfer of cultural wealth. The sales brought desperately needed capital that kept estates running, that paid mounting debts, but they also represented profound cultural loss that many found painful. National treasures leaving the country forever, sailing across the Atlantic, irreplaceable heritage sold to American industrialists who might not even understand what they were buying. Some critics bitterly attacked aristocrats for selling their birthright for cash, for valuing money over heritage, calling them traitors to their class and nation. But the aristocrats facing bankruptcy had impossible choices. Keeping the paintings often meant losing the entire estate, watching it be sold at auction for debts. At least by selling the art privately, they could save the land, keep the family estate intact for another generation. American museum directors benefited enormously from this trade as well, receiving windfalls they'd never dreamed possible. J.P. Morgan eventually left much of his vast holdings to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, transforming it overnight into a world-class institution. Frick's entire house and contents became a public museum after his death, exactly as he'd planned. Other wealthy patrons made similar arrangements, seeing museum donations as their path to immortality. American institutions acquired priceless European masterpieces without having to negotiate with foreign governments or navigate complex international laws. But buying paintings didn't automatically confer genuine sophistication or cultural authority, as the Americans painfully discovered. Critics, especially from Europe, openly mocked them in newspapers and magazines. They pointed out with sharp accuracy that purchasing culture wasn't remotely the same as creating culture or truly understanding it. The Americans were accumulating artifacts like trophies in a hunt, not genuinely appreciating them as art. They were buyers, not connoisseurs, collectors, not scholars. Some of this criticism was entirely accurate and deserved. Many American millionaires did purchase things without understanding them at all beyond their price tags. They relied completely on dealers' advice rather than developing their own eye. They bought primarily for social status rather than personal appreciation or love of art. A few collectors were genuinely knowledgeable, had studied and learned, but many simply wanted impressive galleries to show visitors, wanted to prove they were cultured through their possessions. Isabella Stewart Gardner stood out as a notable exception to this pattern of ignorant collecting. A Boston heiress with genuine passion, she built a Venetian-style palace in Boston specifically designed to house her art treasures. But unlike many wealthy patrons who treated art as status symbols, Gardner understood painting and sculpture deeply and personally. She studied art history intensively. She traveled throughout Europe extensively, spending months examining collections. She befriended artists and scholars, learning from them. Her collection reflected genuine, passionate engagement with art, not just wealth-seeking legitimacy. You could see the difference in how she displayed her pieces, the thought and care evident in every room. The competition between major American buyers drove prices to truly absurd levels that shocked even experienced dealers. When multiple millionaires wanted the same Rembrandt or Vermeer, bidding could reach ridiculous amounts that bore no relation to previous sale prices. Dealers deliberately encouraged this competitive frenzy. They'd hint that another patron was very interested in a particular piece, creating artificial scarcity and urgency. They'd play buyers against each other. The Americans, determined not to be outdone by rivals, paid whatever was asked without negotiating, sometimes significantly more than the actual value. By the early 1900s, the very best European masterpieces were increasingly in American private hands rather than European collections. This represented a massive cultural shift that changed the art world permanently. For centuries, great paintings had stayed in Europe, in the countries and often the regions where they were created. Now they were crossing the Atlantic in huge quantities, flowing toward American wealth. Museums worldwide noticed this shift with alarm and sometimes envy. American institutions were rapidly becoming major cultural centers, rivals to the great European museums. The practice also created certain social obligations that collectors gradually came to understand. If you owned significant pieces, you were expected to eventually share them with the public through museum donations or by opening your private home to serious scholars and students. The Gilded Age patrons largely accepted this responsibility, perhaps because it offered a path to the immortality and respect they craved. They saw themselves as temporary stewards rather than permanent owners. The canvases would outlast them by centuries. Their legacy would be making these masterworks accessible to future generations of Americans who could never afford to buy such things. But World War I changed everything about this cozy transatlantic relationship. Suddenly, buying treasures from Europe felt morally complicated and uncomfortable. American soldiers were fighting and dying in French trenches, defending European civilization. The cultural exchange that had seemed so sophisticated and mutually beneficial now felt ambiguous at best, exploitative at worst. Should Americans really be purchasing treasures from countries they were defending militarily, bleeding to protect? After the war ended, the art market continued operating, but the entire context had shifted fundamentally and irreversibly. The American millionaires who'd built the great private galleries were aging rapidly or dying, their time passing. Their heirs often weren't particularly interested in maintaining huge art holdings, preferring to spend money on modern pursuits like automobiles and airplanes. The concentrated assemblages that had taken decades to build began fragmenting, dispersing. Museums acquired pieces. Some works actually returned to Europe, sold back across the Atlantic. The focused private galleries of the Gilded Age started gradually dispersing, their contents scattered. The whole endeavor ultimately revealed something fundamental about Gilded Age wealth and the psychology driving it. These men could buy absolutely anything their money could reach, but they couldn't buy the one thing they truly wanted most, the thing that motivated all this frantic collecting: legitimacy, cultural authority, the effortless respect and automatic deference that comes from centuries of breeding and refinement that European aristocrats possessed simply by being born. They could own Rembrandt, acquire Vermeer, possess Velázquez, but they couldn't change the basic fact that their money came from oil wells and steel mills and railroad deals. They remained American businessmen who'd gotten very rich through commerce. The paintings couldn't transform them into something else, couldn't make them aristocrats or erase their origins. But the paintings themselves could outlast their temporary owners, could transcend the men who bought them. The works these robber barons purchased still hang in American museums today, seen by millions. The holdings they assembled still benefit the public, enriching American culture. Their money is gone, spent, or dispersed. Their mansions are demolished, reduced to dust and memory. But the canvases remain as beautiful as ever. And in that sense, perhaps they achieved a kind of lasting immortality after all, not the aristocratic legitimacy they desperately sought and never quite obtained, but perhaps something ultimately more valuable and more democratic. A genuine, lasting contribution to American culture that transcends their personal ambitions and survives their grasping desire for status. The paintings remain, and that might be legacy enough. The wealthy believed they controlled their public image completely and absolutely. They owned newspapers and could dictate coverage. They sponsored highly visible charities that generated grateful publicity. They built libraries and museums and universities with their names carved prominently in stone, permanent reminders of their generosity. They assumed public gratitude for their philanthropic largesse, expected admiration for their success. Then the journalists arrived with their notebooks and their questions, and everything changed forever. The term muckraker came from Theodore Roosevelt himself, borrowed from John Bunyan's religious allegory, Pilgrim's Progress. In Bunyan's story, a character rakes muck instead of looking upward toward heaven and celestial glory. Roosevelt meant it as sharp criticism, as an insult. These journalists focused obsessively on society's filth, on corruption and exploitation and suffering rather than celebrating progress and achievement. They exposed scandals instead of praising American success stories. They tore down rather than building up. The muckrakers embraced the term as a badge of honor. Yes, they raked muck, they said proudly, because American society had enormous amounts of muck that desperately needed raking and exposing to sunlight. Someone had to do it. The movement began in popular magazines that reached hundreds of thousands of middle-class readers. McClure's magazine led the way, pioneering serious investigative journalism. Founded in 1893 by Samuel S. McClure, an ambitious editor with progressive instincts, it published serious investigative journalism alongside fiction and general interest articles. McClure understood something crucial about his audience that other publishers had missed. Middle-class Americans wanted desperately to understand the forces shaping their world, changing their lives. They sensed something was profoundly wrong with how wealth and power operated in America. They just needed someone to explain it clearly, to show them the hidden mechanisms. In 1902, McClure's published three absolutely groundbreaking investigative series simultaneously: a coordinated assault on Gilded Age corruption. Lincoln Steffens methodically exposed urban political corruption in The Shame of the Cities, showing how mayors and councilmen sold their offices to the highest bidders. Ray Stannard Baker investigated brutal labor conditions and racial inequality, shining light on suffering most Americans never saw. And Ida Tarbell began her devastating series on Standard Oil that would change everything. Tarbell's work hit hardest and had the most lasting impact on public consciousness. She spent years meticulously researching John D. Rockefeller's business practices, interviewing hundreds of former Standard Oil employees who'd been crushed by the company's ruthless tactics. She obtained confidential internal documents that revealed secret dealings. She traced the company's entire history from its modest founding through its rise to near-complete monopoly power, documenting every ruthless step. What she revealed shocked even cynical readers who thought they understood how business worked. Rockefeller hadn't built Standard Oil through superior products or better service to customers or more efficient operations. He'd used ruthlessly illegal and unethical tactics, secret deals with railroad companies for preferential shipping rates that competitors couldn't access, giving him an insurmountable advantage. Predatory pricing specifically designed to deliberately drive competitors into bankruptcy, selling oil below cost until rivals folded. Industrial espionage to steal competitors' secrets, systematic bribery of public officials, explicit threats of ruin against anyone who dared challenge him. The company had systematically destroyed anyone who stood in its way, crushing them without mercy or hesitation. Tarbell wrote with remarkable precision and admirable restraint, letting the facts speak for themselves. She didn't need sensationalism or exaggeration or inflammatory language. The documented facts were damning enough on their own. She showed methodically, step by step, how Rockefeller's monopoly raised prices for ordinary consumers while crushing small, independent businesses. How the trust concentrated unimaginable wealth in Rockefeller's hands while creating widespread poverty. How one man's fortune came at immense cost to thousands of others whose lives he destroyed in his pursuit of dominance. The series ran from 1902 to 1904, published in monthly installments that readers eagerly awaited. Then it was published as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, which became an immediate bestseller. Suddenly, seemingly overnight, Rockefeller's image transformed completely. He wasn't a captain of industry anymore, not a brilliant businessman who'd built something great. He was a robber baron. His vast wealth wasn't admirable achievement deserving respect. It was stolen goods acquired through systematic exploitation and illegal tactics. Rockefeller tried desperately defending himself and his reputation. He pointed to his extensive philanthropy with genuine hurt and confusion. The libraries he'd funded, the universities bearing his name, the medical research he'd supported, that was saving lives. Shouldn't his charitable work count for something? Didn't the good he'd done balance the methods he'd used? The public wasn't buying his defense anymore. The scales had fallen from their eyes. As one critic memorably put it in a phrase that spread nationwide, Rockefeller was giving away with one hand what he'd systematically stolen with the other. The philanthropy didn't erase or excuse the brutal methods used to acquire the fortune. Blood money remained blood money even when donated to seemingly good causes. You couldn't wash away exploitation with charitable donations. Other muckrakers eagerly followed Tarbell's example, seeing that exposés sold magazines and books. Upton Sinclair investigated the meatpacking industry, spending weeks inside Chicago stockyards. His novel, The Jungle, published in 1906, exposed absolutely horrific conditions that turned readers' stomachs. Spoiled meat deliberately sold to consumers, workers losing fingers in machinery with no compensation, rats falling into sausage grinders and being processed as food. The descriptions were so vivid and disturbing, they provoked physical revulsion. The public reaction was immediate and furious. President Roosevelt himself, after reading the book, immediately invited Sinclair to the White House for a meeting and ordered federal investigations into meatpacking. Sinclair had actually intended primarily to highlight worker exploitation, the dangerous conditions, the poverty wages, the complete lack of rights or protections. But readers fixated obsessively on the contaminated food instead. As Sinclair later said with wry disappointment, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." Still, the book achieved concrete results. The Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act both passed through Congress in 1906, directly due to the jungle's shocking impact on public opinion and political pressure. David Graham Phillips attacked political corruption with equal vigor. His explosive series, The Treason of the Senate, published in 1906, showed in damning detail how wealthy industrialists controlled senators through systematic bribery and influence. The Senate was supposed to represent the people, to be the deliberative body of American democracy. Instead, it served corporate interests exclusively, senators acting as paid employees of trusts and monopolies. Phillips named specific names, documented particular payments, showed the corruption mechanisms clearly enough that even ordinary citizens could understand how the system worked. The attacks extended methodically to virtually every major industry and powerful individual. Thomas Lawson, a former stockbroker turned reformer, wrote Frenzied Finance, exposing elaborate stock manipulation schemes that cheated ordinary investors. Charles Edward Russell investigated the beef trust's monopoly. Ray Stannard Baker wrote extensively about railroad monopolies and their stranglehold on commerce. Every major industry came under intense public scrutiny, stripped bare for all to see. The magazines that published these explosive exposés saw circulation soar dramatically, proving there was enormous public appetite for this material. McClure's reached hundreds of thousands of readers across the country. Collier's Weekly, Everybody's Magazine, The American Magazine, all published muckraking journalism that flew off newsstands. Publishers discovered that exposing corruption sold copies better than almost anything else. Readers were hungry, almost desperate for this information about how their society really worked. The wealthy fought back hard with all their resources. They pressured advertisers to boycott muckraking magazines, threatening to pull their own advertising. They bought newspapers outright to counter the negative narratives creating friendly publications. They hired public relations firms, a brand new industry, to improve their battered images through carefully orchestrated campaigns. John D. Rockefeller Jr., trying desperately to rehabilitate his father's destroyed reputation, hired Ivy Lee, one of America's very first professional PR consultants. Lee advised a completely new approach, a softer public face. Show Rockefeller as human and relatable, not as a distant money machine. Photograph him giving dimes to children on the street, a now famous image. Emphasize his religious faith and church attendance. Focus relentlessly on philanthropy in all public statements. Most importantly, don't address the specific criticisms directly. Don't engage with the accusations. Just flood the zone with positive stories and images until the negative ones gradually faded from public memory. The strategy partially worked over many years. Rockefeller's public image did improve somewhat, slowly, becoming less purely negative. But the fundamental damage remained permanent and irreversible. The muckrakers had shown convincingly, with documents and testimony, that great fortunes were built on systematic exploitation. The public couldn't unknow that truth once they'd learned it. The investigations also led to concrete legal reforms that changed America. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. Each piece of legislation directly addressed problems that muckrakers had exposed to public view and outrage. The journalism had real measurable impact beyond just words. It changed actual laws. It changed how Americans viewed wealth and power and the relationship between them. For the Gilded Age elite, this journalistic assault was utterly devastating, an attack they couldn't defeat with money. They genuinely assumed their wealth conferred moral authority, that their financial success proved they deserved power. The muckrakers challenged that fundamental assumption directly and destroyed it. They showed that wealth often came from exploitation rather than talent, that monopoly power came from corruption and illegal tactics rather than superior efficiency, that the game was rigged from the start. The psychological impact was significant and lasting, perhaps deeper than the legal changes. The wealthy had largely believed their own narratives and self-justifications. They genuinely thought they were benefactors bringing progress, job creators helping workers, nation builders making America great. The muckrakers forcefully reframed them as predators feeding on the weak, thieves stealing from workers, oppressors crushing anyone in their path. That reframing was impossible to shake once it took hold in public consciousness. Public opinion shifted dramatically and measurably. In 1880, most Americans genuinely admired wealthy industrialists as heroes. By 1910, many viewed them with deep suspicion or outright hostility. The change wasn't universal or complete. Some people still defended the robber barons, still believed in their mythology, but the broad consensus had cracked badly, perhaps irreparably. Wealth no longer automatically commanded respect or deference. This shift made the entire social system much harder to maintain. When Mrs. Astor threw her elaborate balls in the 1880s, newspapers had covered them admiringly as glittering social events. By the early 1900s, coverage turned sharply critical, questioning the morality of such excess. Why were the wealthy spending fortunes on parties when workers starved in tenements? The same actions that once seemed glamorous now seemed morally obscene, almost criminal in their callousness. The muckrakers also inspired an entire generation of reformers. Young people read these exposés and decided to fight for change, to challenge power. Future progressives, labor leaders, and reform politicians traced their political awakening directly to muckraking journalism. The articles provided essential education about how power actually worked. They showed clearly that change was genuinely possible, that the system wasn't fixed and inevitable. By 1912, the peak muckraking era was waning, the movement losing steam. Magazines faced severe economic pressure from withdrawn advertising. Some publications folded entirely, others toned down their criticism to survive financially. The peak moment of exposure and public outrage had passed, but the damage from the wealthy's perspective was permanent and irreversible. The muckrakers had destroyed the moral authority of Gilded Age fortunes beyond repair. They'd shown that wealth came from exploitation, that monopolies harmed the public, that the system was deliberately rigged to benefit those at the top. You couldn't go back from that knowledge. Once Americans understood how their society actually worked, how wealth was really accumulated, they couldn't pretend otherwise or return to comfortable ignorance. And that understanding created powerful demand for fundamental change, real structural change, the kind that would eventually dismantle the Gilded Age entirely. The muckrakers didn't destroy the Gilded Age alone, but they provided the intellectual ammunition. They gave reformers the facts they needed. They turned public opinion decisively against unchecked wealth. They made continued excess politically impossible. The wealthy never forgave them, but the damage was done. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back. The workers had been patient for decades, accepting poverty wages without complaint, enduring dangerous conditions that killed and maimed, watching enormous fortunes accumulate at the very top while they struggled desperately to feed their families. But patience has limits. By the 1890s, those limits had been reached and exceeded. Across America, workers began fighting back, not with petitions or polite requests, with strikes, work stoppages that shut down entire industries, confrontations that sometimes turned shockingly violent. The Gilded Age elite suddenly discovered that their vast wealth depended entirely on workers who'd finally decided they'd had enough. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 set the pattern for everything that followed. It started in West Virginia when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced another wage cut. Workers had endured cut after cut. This time, they walked off the job. The strike spread like wildfire along rail lines to Maryland, then Pennsylvania, then across the entire country. Within weeks, tens of thousands had stopped working, paralyzing commerce. The railroads brought in strikebreakers, armed guards to protect them. The strikers fought them in the streets. Violence erupted in multiple cities simultaneously. In Pittsburgh, state militia fired directly into crowds, killing 20. Enraged rioters burned railroad property in response, millions of dollars going up in flames. The strike lasted 45 days before federal troops finally restored order at gunpoint. The 1880s brought more conflicts, each one larger than the last. In 1886, the Haymarket Affair in Chicago shocked and terrified the nation. Workers were striking for a basic 8-hour workday, considered a radical demand. During a peaceful rally in Haymarket Square, someone threw a bomb at police. 7 officers died in the explosion. Police opened fire indiscriminately on the crowd. 4 workers died. 8 anarchists were quickly arrested and tried in a show trial. 4 were hanged, though evidence actually connecting them to the bombing was extremely thin, almost non-existent. The Haymarket Affair terrified the wealthy beyond anything before. If workers were willing to use bombs, nowhere was safe. The Fifth Avenue mansions could be targeted, the Newport cottages, the private railroad cars. Security increased dramatically overnight. Armed guards were hired. Paranoia set in deep, changing how the wealthy moved through their own cities. The strikes continued relentlessly throughout the decade. Steel workers, coal miners, textile workers, virtually every major industry experienced serious labor unrest. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Workers demanded better wages or conditions, basic dignity. Management refused without negotiation. Workers struck. Management brought in armed replacement workers. Violence often followed, blood on both sides. The Homestead Strike of 1892 was particularly brutal and remains infamous. Andrew Carnegie's steel plant in Pennsylvania. Workers struck over yet another wage cut. Henry Clay Frick, managing the plant in Carnegie's absence, hired 300 Pinkerton detectives as private security, essentially a private army. The Pinkertons arrived by barge on the river. Armed workers met them at the dock in the pre-dawn darkness. A 12-hour gun battle followed, a small war. 10 died. Dozens were wounded. The state militia eventually broke the strike with overwhelming force. The workers lost everything. The Union was destroyed and wouldn't recover for decades. But Carnegie's reputation suffered permanent damage he could never repair. He'd been conveniently in Scotland during the strike, claiming complete ignorance of Frick's violent tactics. Nobody believed him. The man who publicly preached the gospel of wealth, who wrote essays about the obligations of the rich, had ordered armed guards to shoot striking workers. The hypocrisy was too blatant to ignore. The Pullman strike of 1894 showed labor's growing organizational power across industries. When the Pullman Palace Car Company cut wages without reducing rents in company housing, workers struck. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, supported them by refusing to handle any Pullman cars anywhere. The boycott paralyzed rail traffic nationwide, bringing commerce to a halt. President Cleveland intervened directly, sending federal troops to break the strike by force. He claimed mail delivery was being disrupted, making it a federal matter. Soldiers forced trains through at bayonet point. Debs was arrested and imprisoned. The strike collapsed, but it demonstrated something that scared the wealthy more than any isolated strike ever had. Workers could now organize effectively across entire industries. The implications were terrifying. Each strike brought the same reflexive response from management: refuse to negotiate under any circumstances, hire replacement workers, use violence if necessary to break the strike. The wealthy saw any compromise as fatal weakness. If you gave in to one group of workers, others would immediately make demands. Better to crush them all decisively, to show strength. But the strikes revealed something important that was changing the balance of power. The Gilded Age depended absolutely on cheap, docile labor. The mansions required dozens of underpaid servants to function. The factories needed workers willing to accept poverty wages and dangerous conditions. The railroads couldn't run without engineers and conductors working long hours for little pay. If those workers refused, if they organized and struck, the whole system stopped. Everything ground to a halt. This gave labor unexpected power despite their lack of resources. Not enough to win most strikes, not yet. Management usually prevailed through superior resources and state support, but enough to make the wealthy genuinely nervous. Enough to show that their control wasn't absolute or permanent, that their fortunes depended on continued cooperation from people they'd systematically exploited for decades. Public opinion was shifting too, gradually but unmistakably. Middle-class Americans, who might once have automatically sided with management against strikers, began sympathizing with workers. The muckrakers' exposés had shown the exploitation clearly. People understood why workers were angry, why they were willing to fight. When state militias shot striking workers to protect corporate property, it looked like wealthy men using state power to defend private profits. This created mounting political pressure for reform. If violent strikes were the alternative to modest changes, maybe reform made sense. Progressive politicians began pushing labor reforms with growing success: limits on working hours, basic safety regulations, the right to organize unions. Nothing revolutionary, but definite movement in labor's direction, small victories. The wealthy resisted all of it with every resource they had. They argued that business couldn't survive with government regulations, that free markets required complete freedom from interference, that workers were already free to quit if they didn't like conditions. Government interference would destroy American prosperity and competitiveness. But they were steadily losing the argument. Too many people had seen the alternative to unregulated capitalism. It had created obscene inequality. Workers weren't free to quit when quitting meant starvation. The market wasn't working for most Americans. Something fundamental had to change. The biggest change came in 1913. Congress passed the 16th Amendment, creating a federal income tax. For the first time in American history, the government could directly tax wealth. The wealthy had fought this desperately for decades. Previous attempts at income taxes had been struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional, but the progressive movement finally forced it through with overwhelming public support. The amendment was ratified in February 1913. By October, the first income tax law was in effect. The initial rates were modest, almost symbolic: 1% on income over $3,000, up to 7% on income over $500,000. The wealthy could easily afford it, but the principle terrified them. If the government could tax income, it could tax wealth. The power to tax was the power to destroy, as the saying went, and the rates would only rise. Within just a few years, as World War I required massive government spending, top rates climbed dramatically. By 1918, the highest bracket paid 77%. The days of accumulating unlimited untaxed wealth were over forever. The income tax fundamentally changed the economics of everything. Building a mansion became less attractive when you couldn't keep as much of your earnings. Employing 50 servants made less sense when labor costs couldn't be offset against much lower net income. Throwing $100,000 parties felt wasteful when taxes claimed most of your profits before you could spend them. The wealthy adapted quickly, hiring accountants and lawyers. They established trusts to shelter money. They moved assets offshore to avoid taxes. Tax avoidance became an entire industry, but they couldn't avoid taxation entirely. The government was taking a substantial cut. That was permanent. Inheritance taxes followed soon after. The government began taxing estates heavily when wealth passed to heirs. This prevented fortunes from accumulating indefinitely across generations. Each generation faced steep taxes. Over time, even the largest fortunes would be eroded by this steady drain. The combination was devastating to Gilded Age economics. Labor unrest made businesses less profitable. Income taxes claimed much of what remained. Inheritance taxes prevented passing full fortunes to children. The system that had created massive wealth concentration was being systematically dismantled piece by piece, slowly strangled. By 1915, the economic landscape had shifted dramatically. Workers were increasingly organized, strikes were common occurrences, progressive reforms were passing regularly through Congress, taxes were climbing steadily. The wealthy still had enormous resources, but the trajectory was absolutely clear. Their position was steadily weakening. The Gilded Age was ending. And then came the war. World War I would accelerate everything: the labor shortages, the massive taxation, the profound social changes. The conflict would reshape American society so thoroughly that the Gilded Age could never return. Even if the wealthy wanted to restore it, the world that had made it possible was gone forever. Cornelius Vanderbilt III inherited his grandfather's mansion in 1926. He didn't want it. Not even slightly. The house at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street remained magnificent by any objective measure. 130 rooms sprawling across an entire city block. The largest private residence Manhattan had ever seen. It had consumed over $3 million in construction 44 years earlier. It represented the absolute peak of Gilded Age architectural ambition, a monument to wealth and power. But it also consumed $30,000 annually in property taxes alone. The city assessed it at its true value, and the taxes were crushing. Add heating costs for winter, electricity for lights, basic maintenance and repairs that never ended, insurance for the building and its priceless contents. The bare minimum carrying costs exceeded $100,000 every single year. And those were just carrying costs. To actually live in the house, to use it as it was designed, you needed to employ at minimum 30 staff members, probably closer to 50 for proper operation. That meant another 100,000 or more in annual wages, plus room and board for live-in staff. Cornelius III looked at these numbers with growing horror. He was wealthy by any normal standard, but he couldn't afford this house. Nobody could anymore. Not in this new world. The economics had fundamentally changed. His grandfather, Cornelius II, had lived during an era of no income tax whatsoever. Every dollar earned was a dollar kept. Accumulating wealth was straightforward. Make money, keep money, buy property. Simple. By 1926, everything had changed. The top income tax bracket was 25%. It had peaked at 77% during the war and would likely rise again. But even at 25%, it meant giving a quarter of your income to the government before paying any other expenses, before you could spend a single dollar on yourself. Inheritance taxes made everything worse. When Cornelius II died, his fortune had passed to heirs with minimal taxation. By the 1920s, estate taxes claimed huge portions of inherited wealth. The money that had funded the mansion's original construction simply couldn't be replicated by heirs facing modern taxation. The math no longer worked. The servant situation was equally impossible to solve. Before the war, finding qualified household help had been easy. Young immigrants arrived daily, desperate for work. Domestic positions, while poorly paid, offered employment and security, but everything had changed. Post-war opportunities had exploded. Factories paid better than service. Retail positions offered freedom. Working in a shop meant leaving at closing time, having your own life. Fewer people were willing to work as live-in help, to be available 24 hours a day. Those still willing to serve demanded dramatically higher wages. The supply and demand imbalance worked entirely in workers' favor now. Cornelius III did the brutal mathematics. To maintain a Fifth Avenue palace like his grandfather's required perhaps $250,000 annually, maybe more. To generate that income after taxes required earning far more, perhaps $400,000 or $500,000. You needed an absolutely enormous fortune producing substantial returns. And even then, most of that fortune would flow directly into maintaining one single house. The numbers were inescapable. The mansion was a financial black hole. Cornelius III made the only rational decision possible: sell it. The house went to Bergdorf Goodman, the luxury department store, for $7 million. They wanted the land. The building itself meant nothing to them. It was just an obstacle to be removed, demolished to make room for something profitable. Within months, the wrecking crews arrived. The mansion started coming down. Cornelius III wasn't alone in this decision. All along Fifth Avenue, similar brutal calculations were happening simultaneously. One by one, the palaces fell. Andrew Carnegie's widow sold his mansion in 1929. The house was barely 30 years old. It had been designed and built to last for centuries, to house generations of the Carnegie family. It lasted less than 3 decades before economics made it unsustainable. The Astor mansions came down, demolished for commercial development. The Havmeyer house was torn apart. The Senator William Andrews Clark Palace, which had consumed $7 million and 7 full years to build, was demolished in 1927. Just 16 years after completion, gone. One by one, block by block, the monuments to Gilded Age excess disappeared from Fifth Avenue, erased from the landscape as if they'd never existed. The families selling these properties weren't broke. Many remained genuinely wealthy, but wealth alone wasn't enough anymore. You needed truly extraordinary resources to maintain these palaces, and increasingly the resources required exceeded what even wealthy families could justify spending. The cost was simply too high for what you received in return. Some tried adapting, tried to make it work. They closed off entire floors, leaving rooms unused and unheated. They lived in just a few rooms, ignoring the rest. They reduced staff to bare minimums. But living in a 50-room mansion with 5 servants meant the house inevitably deteriorated. Rooms went unheated and damp. Leaks weren't promptly repaired. Standards declined visibly. Decay set in. The buildings had been designed to require full staffing. Without it, they literally fell apart around you. Others attempted converting mansions to different uses: apartments for multiple families, office buildings, private clubs. But the buildings weren't designed for conversion. The rooms were too large, proportions all wrong, the layouts too specific to their original purpose. Electrical and plumbing systems were hopelessly outdated. Converting actually cost more than simply demolishing and building something new from scratch. And the land values made demolition economically inevitable. A Fifth Avenue lot was worth millions, but only if you could build something profitable on it. A mansion housing one family generated no income whatsoever. It was just expense. But an apartment building housing dozens of families, or a commercial building with shops and offices, generated substantial revenue. The financial logic was completely overwhelming, impossible to fight. The decision was simple: sell the land, demolish the mansion, build something modern that generates returns. Developers eagerly paid premium prices because they knew they could make money. The numbers worked for commercial use. The families accepted because keeping the houses meant slowly going broke, watching your fortune drain away to maintain one building. But the emotional cost was real and significant. These weren't just buildings. They were family homes filled with memories, places where children had grown up and played, where weddings had happened, where parents and grandparents had lived their lives. Selling meant admitting publicly that an era was over, that the family's glory days had passed, that you couldn't maintain your ancestors' legacy. Some descendants fought desperately to keep houses. They borrowed money against other assets. They deferred essential maintenance. They struggled on year after year, refusing to admit defeat, but most eventually surrendered to mathematical reality. The economics were simply inescapable. You couldn't maintain Gilded Age mansions on post-Gilded Age incomes. The world had changed too much. The demolitions happened with shocking speed once they started. Wrecking crews could completely tear down a massive mansion in just weeks. The limestone facades that had taken years to carve were smashed to rubble in days. The ornate interiors were brutally gutted. Some architectural elements were carefully saved and sold to collectors or donated to museums, but most became landfill, buried and forgotten. Photographs from the era show surreal scenes. These palaces being systematically destroyed, walls knocked down, revealing interior rooms, roofs collapsed inward, elegant facades suddenly punctured with gaping holes. The contrast between the building's former grandeur and their violent demolition was stark and disturbing. What had taken years to build vanished in days. New York wasn't alone in this transformation. Similar patterns played out across American cities. The Chicago mansions came down. The Philadelphia estates were sold and demolished. Newport's cottages fared slightly better because they were seasonal vacation homes, not year round residences, but even there, many were demolished or abandoned to decay. The speed of transformation shocked observers. In 1890, Fifth Avenue was lined with magnificent mansions. By 1930, most were simply gone. 40 years from construction to demolition, buildings designed to stand for centuries didn't survive even half that time. What replaced them told its own story about changing values. Department stores where anyone with money could shop, office buildings housing businesses, apartment houses where dozens of families lived in the space one family had occupied, commercial enterprises open to the public. The exclusive residential district became mixed use. Public access replaced private privilege. The physical landscape reflected fundamentally changed social values, and a few mansions survived, but only by transforming their purpose. Henry Clay Frick's house became the museum he'd planned all along. His widow lived there until 1931. Then the Frick collection opened to the public. Today, anyone can visit for the price of admission. You can walk through rooms where one of America's richest men lived, see the paintings he collected, experience a frozen moment of Gilded Age life. The survivors were rare exceptions. Most are gone forever. Where the Vanderbilt mansion stood is now Bergdorf Goodman's elegant store. Where Astor houses were is now commercial real estate generating steady returns. The physical evidence of the Gilded Age mostly disappeared, demolished, and buried. The demolitions represented more than just architectural loss. They marked the definitive end of an economic system, the end of a social structure, the end of an entire era when unlimited wealth accumulation seemed possible and maintaining private urban palaces seemed feasible. The heirs weren't failures. They simply lived in different times, times with much higher taxes, higher labor costs, different social values, times when spending $250,000 annually on one house seemed wasteful rather than admirable, times when economic realities made such spending literally impossible even for the wealthy. The Gilded Age had built its monuments in limestone and marble. Then economic and social forces made those monuments unsustainable. The mansions came down not because of disaster or deliberate destruction. They fell because nobody could afford to keep them standing. The mathematics of collapse was irresistible. The 1920s and 30s transformed Fifth Avenue beyond recognition, beyond imagination. Where French chateaux had stood, sleek Art Deco towers rose skyward. Where private palaces had occupied entire blocks, apartment buildings now housed hundreds of families living stacked lives. The architectural style of replacement buildings tells its own story about changing American values. Art Deco was aggressively modern, clean lines, geometric patterns, no historical pretense or backward glancing. These buildings didn't try to look like European palaces. They announced themselves as thoroughly American and completely contemporary. The future, not the past, progress, not nostalgia. But not everything was demolished. A few precious Gilded Age structures survived by transforming their purpose entirely. They became museums, clubs, schools, cultural institutions serving the public. Survival required opening to the public. Private palaces had to become public resources or disappear. The Frick collection stands today as perhaps the finest example. Walking through it feels like visiting a Gilded Age mansion frozen in time, preserved like an insect in amber. The paintings Frick collected still hang on the walls. The furniture remains in place. The rooms are arranged much as they were when he lived and entertained there, except now anyone can visit. Pay admission and you enter a world that was once completely, absolutely private. And the Morgan Library followed a similar path to survival. J.P. Morgan's personal library became a museum after his son donated it to the public in 1924. The rare books, illuminated manuscripts, and artworks Morgan collected are now available to scholars and ordinary visitors alike. These institutions preserved not just buildings but entire collections. The art the robber barons accumulated didn't vanish into private hands. It was made accessible. In a deeply ironic way, their fortunes ended up serving the public good they'd often ignored while alive, while building their empires. What survived did so by transforming, by opening to the public, by serving broader purposes beyond one family's comfort. The private palaces that became public institutions endured. The ones that remained exclusively private vanished completely. That might be the final lesson of the Gilded Age. The last truth revealed by its rise and fall. Wealth that serves only itself doesn't last. Fortunes that benefit only their owners eventually get dispersed and forgotten. Buildings that house only one family inevitably get demolished. But resources dedicated to public benefit can endure. The art collections, the libraries, the museums. These legacies outlasted the fortunes that created them, outlasted the men who accumulated the wealth. The Gilded Age ended. Its mansions fell beneath wrecking balls. Its rigid social system collapsed, but transformed into institutions serving everyone. Some of what it created survives, not as monuments to individual wealth and power, but as resources for learning and beauty available to all, not as private luxury hoarded and hidden, but as shared cultural heritage. The age ended, but pieces of it, fundamentally repurposed and democratized, remain. The palaces are gone, but the paintings endure. And perhaps that's justice of a kind. The men are forgotten, but the beauty remains, accessible to anyone who seeks it. The Gilded Age destroyed itself through its own excess, through inequality so extreme it couldn't be sustained. But from its ruins came something unexpected: public institutions, shared culture, democratic access to beauty that was once locked away. The wrecking balls fell, the limestone crumbled, the gold leaf faded, but the art remains, the books remain, the music remains, and that in the end might be legacy enough.